Welcome to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One. I am Mark Hamilton, joined by my co-host, my peer, my colleague, Mr. Mark Daly. It is the eve of the US Grand Prix at the Circuit of the Americas in Austin. People are arriving, the teams are landing, fans are congregating in Austin from all over the continental US, and it is an excitement bonanza. I've been joining Spaces chats all weekend. People are talking, Twitter's abuzz. It is a blockbuster, total sellout. There's reason to be excited, and probably not just because this is the first time we've had a Grand Prix on this continent since 2019, but the upswell, the groundswell of support for Formula One is perhaps at an all-time high in the United States, and that's really why we're doing an extra show this week. We usually don't record on Monday unless there's a Grand Prix the day before, but there's so much to get through. We've got so many great questions. We thought we'd throw an extra episode out there. Mr. Daly, how are you, my friend?
I am not too bad. I struggled through Monday, full disclosure, but there was a pretty good football game to watch earlier tonight, which kind of washed out the bitter taste of Monday. But like you said, we are on the eve of something. I kind of forgot what it was with all those eves going on, but I kid. The US Grand Prix literally just days away now. Exciting. It'll be great to be able to finally watch a race again in our own time zone, because we're not exactly in our time zone, but close enough. And we get so few of those that we can watch live each and every week without having to get up at like 3 a.m. here on the West Coast. So that is absolutely a bonus. Really looking forward to this one. And I'm hoping that I'll get some good rest between now and Sunday, because I'm pretty pumped for this one, I have to say.
I have to ask as well, my boss is a huge Buffalo Bills fan. He grew up in Southern Ontario in the Greater Toronto area, and there's a lot of Bills fans in that neck of our Canadian woods. I got to ask, did the Bills win? Did the Bills lose? Because depending on your answer, I'm going to have to approach my workday slightly differently tomorrow.
Yes, I hate to tell that all those fans in Southern Ontario that the Toronto Bills did lose tonight. It was an exciting game. Derrick Henry and the Tennessee Titans won 34-31, but it was a good game. It was a fun game to watch. So
it just means that my boss won't have the normal patience for my regular shenanigans during the workday.
And nor should he.
Yeah, I'll have to approach my workday with a little more professionalism than I would otherwise. So good looking out. Thank you, my friend. So with all of that said, we promised to get right down to business today, simply because we've got so much to get through. Yeah. We've got some great questions that came in through Twitter. We've got some even better questions that came in from email. But before we do, we had some technical issues getting the podcast off the ground tonight. And in the meantime, one of our listeners who lives in Toronto, but is from Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, was messaging me, and he and I have casually been talking about me going to the Grand Prix in Saudi Arabia with them, but those conversations have kind of picked up some steam recently, since I'll be in the region anyways. And in the time that we were down trying to get this podcast up tonight, those conversations accelerated, and right before you said we're good to go, I was about to click buy on some tickets on Expedia. So you may have just saved me from a very difficult conversation with my wife, because she's not informed on that entire subject. So thank you for saving me from some scolding that would have been much deserved.
I was just going to say, if there was something important like having to book some plane tickets or something like that, I could have waited a couple more minutes, because I was struggling here. I like to reboot my computer before we start, and I rebooted in plenty of time, and then for some reason Windows just didn't want to cooperate, but I guess Windows is as Windows does. So
yeah, let me just check here. So the last time I rebooted my Mac was 2017, exactly. Which is roughly around the time so all the shenanigans aside, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Okay.
We've got some breaking news. Well, it's breaking in the sense that it happened right after we published the last podcast, but the 2022 calendar is out.
Yeah, so this is this is great, because it's funny. It seems like every time that the way that we record the show doesn't really have a lot of congruency with like the Formula One news cycle, and it seems, I think we've made the sarcastic comment many times in the past that by the time you download this will be official, of course, and it usually is. But yes, joking aside, Formula One did finally release the 2022 calendar. So March 20th, we are back racing in Bahrain, followed up by a week later in Saudi Arabia, and then back to Australia in April, and I'm really looking forward to going back to Australia. I mean, it's been on again, off again, and it's been more off than on, obviously, and we're not going to go there at all this year, so good to see it back on. Imola, April 24th, Miami, May 8th, Spain, Monaco, Azerbaijan, Canada, June 19th, then we go back to Europe with the UK, Austria, France, Hungary on July 31st, then we go into the summer break. Then we come back at the end of August for Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and that will be Monza, Russia, Singapore. Good to see Singapore back on the schedule. Japan, USA, Mexico, Brazil, and Abu Dhabi. So pretty much a very familiar end to the season, but some interesting twists. I'm glad to see Imola back, and it's going to be a busy year in 2020. 22,
yeah, absolutely.
Not 20U.
A couple of the takeaways that I had looking at this is I think a lot of us are excited to be back at Imola. Understand that Imola is really a placeholder because we're expecting to see China back on for 2023. Yeah. So that's not a permanent addition, although I think you could probably make a business case and a historical legacy case for retaining that beyond 2023. But one of the things that I thought was quite interesting was a story broke earlier tonight from a news channel in Las Vegas, and Adam Stern, retweeted this a little earlier, that there are quote-unquote executives traveling to COTA, traveling to Austin for some high-level negotiations with Liberty about bringing a Formula One race to Las Vegas as soon as 2023. That's not even remotely realistic, but just reinforces the fact that you and I have been on this bandwagon beating this drum for some time, that Liberty's long-term, medium-term, short-term ambition has always been, will always be, to have 3 races in the US. And the reality is having 3 races enables them to greatly expand the exposure of the sport, and it also significantly increases the value of any network TV deals, right? Like, this is the same thing that we saw in the late 80s and the early 90s when the NBA invited Orlando and Miami and Minnesota and Charlotte into their ranks, and it was why the NHL expanded so aggressively throughout the United States in the 1990s, because they recognized that the future of the sport wasn't gate revenue, it was TV network money. But the NHL can't go knocking on the doors of big networks in the US if you have 21 teams and 7 of them are based in Canada. So they expanded rapidly because they needed to create additional viewership so that they could sell these networks sell the product onto the networks. Now, Major League Baseball was a little bit different because in the early 90s, they expanded largely to offset the losses from the fact that the owners were caught colluding in the 80s, which is a whole different story. But yeah, the calendar itself, and I get a little off topic, 23 races, the longest calendar that we've ever had. You and I have spoken about this before. It's going to get longer probably before it ever gets shorter. The most recent Concord agreement, which runs from 2021 to 2025, stipulates up to 25 races. So 23 is just the next step in Liberty's ambitions to continue growing the sport. Any big takeaways, anything that you saw or that kind of stood out to you when you took the first glance at the calendar?
Well, like I was saying, I think it was interesting to see that there is the addition of Imola, which will be, I guess, a 3rd year in a row, which, like you say, I think there's a good case to make it a permanent track. I mean, we had some good races there over the past couple of years. Good to see some of the more classic tracks coming back, if you want to call them that. And good to see, obviously the Netherlands is going to be there for the next foreseeable future, but interesting to finally see where Miami kind of fits into the bigger picture as well. And then just more to your point about getting another race in the USA, specifically Las Vegas, that kind of makes sense too. I mean, not to take away anything from COTA and Austin. I mean, they've done a great job hosting that Grand Prix over the last number of years, but to really make an impact, like you say, I mean, there has to be more than one race a year. I mean, there's only one race that only hits one track in the United States in a calendar year. That's a really tough sell. I mean, it's a really brief thing that makes it hard to really get people excited about. But, if you're going to have Miami at the middle of the year, COTA at the back end of the year, maybe you fit Las Vegas in there somewhere as well, potentially, then I think it makes it more sellable, like you say, to the networks. And I think it gives fans based in North America a lot to look forward to as well. Because, I mean, it's still, despite all the phenomenal growth and interest that we've seen during the past 12 months or so, that it really is an undertapped and underutilized market here in terms of growing the sport and the exposure on many, many levels.
I think two more quick points before we move on to the next topic, which in itself is actually interrelated with this one. Canada's back. It'll be the first time since 2019. So as much as it's been painful to not go to COTA for a couple of years, it'll be 3 years between trips to Montreal, which is great. And the other curious thing too is Jeddah, the Saudi race, is going to debut at the beginning of December this year. It kicks off the calendar on March 27th, so I guess it'll be the second race after Bahrain. But that's only 3.5 months between trips to that track. So we'll get to become quite intimate with that track at the Jeddah Corniche early. So again, I'm excited to see that track, but it's interesting that we'll be there twice in 3.5 months. And again, we've spoken to that before, that the only reason it's on the calendar this year is because Liberty went and knocked on the doors and said, hey, we could really help yourself, or you could really help us pad the schedule for 2021, given the uncertainties regarding COVID.
One thing too that before we move on with this, I can't honestly say that I'm disappointed to see that, China isn't back. I have to admit, I'm not really a huge fan of the Shanghai International Circuit. I mean, it's got some good portions to the track, but if it was a better, more exciting track, like a venue for the cars, I would be a little bit more disappointed. But I really don't know if there's anywhere else they could host a race. I don't know if there are any other tracks within China that have that that level license to host a Formula One race, but that track has never really done anything for me.
I feel exactly the same way. I feel bad for the fans in that country because I think there are some really great Formula One fans in that country of more than 1 billion people.
100%.
But I think that track does a disservice to the sport, and I think it does a disservice to the fans. It seems bland. It seems gray. It seems sterile. It's not in a great locale. It's parked really next to an industrial park. It doesn't have a lot of atmosphere. Doesn't have a lot of energy. I think I would love to see, obviously, a better track that is more racy and perhaps extracts a little bit more from the fan experience. But to me, it's always felt very gray, very generic. And the fans in that country have deserved better.
Oh, totally. The thing is, I've never been able to figure out, like, what is the identity of this track? Like, what is this track trying to be? Like, is this a power circuit? Is this a tight technical circuit? It seems like they tried to do too much when they designed it. And it just doesn't work. Anyways, moving along, and you hinted at this already, Sebastian Vettel said that Formula One could stop being special because, basically we're getting too many races on the calendar for next year. Anyways, Seb had to say, quote, "This is only my opinion and it's not worth anything, but I think we should not have that many races. It's for a number of reasons. I think one, maybe it's too many races for people to watch. It's not special anymore if there's that many. And second, I feel for the staff, us drivers, we are at the good side of things. We can arrive on a Wednesday night and leave if we find a flight, etc. on a Sunday night. But the team already has a lot more stress. They arrived on Monday or Saturday the week before. They build the garage, prepare the cars, and then they also have to run the full week and then pack down, send everything back, and prepare in the factory. For them, it's a job that you're busy all weekdays and nearly every weekend, so you have no time for yourself. And I think we are in a time where people are growing more and more conscious that they have a life too, and that the life doesn't belong to the employer." End quote. He might be kind of downplaying his comments a little bit, saying this is my opinion and it's not worth anything. Hey, Seb, you're a 4-time world champion. You're racing for a pretty big team. You have a voice, and I'm glad you're making that voice heard. I think it's very important because it's easy for us to sit down on a Sunday, turn on our TV, turn on our iPad or laptop, however we enjoy Formula One, and sit down for a couple of hours and then go and rage about it or gloat on social media, whatever the case may be, and then we're done, right? But it is a huge, huge ask. And we've talked about it quite a bit over the past several weeks. And I'm really glad to see somebody of Sebastian's stature and standing within Formula One stand up and say something. I think it's good.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's not just this issue that Seb has leveraged his platform to promote and to discuss and to bring awareness to. We've seen him take all kinds of other social positions and social stands. Yep. I think he recognizes that, look, my career is finite. I'm not going to be here forever. And if I'm passionate about certain subjects and topics, whether it's the environment, and obviously he's been very big on sustainability and Formula One's role in the global landscape of sustainability and moving us towards a more sustainable future when it comes to the consumption of fossil fuels and leveraging more sustainable fuel sources. He's been a big part of that. All kinds of other really important social issues. It's good to see. I think it's important, and I really processed this internally when we were at Turkey, and there were so many people asking the drivers and asking the teams and asking the team principals about the impact of a 23 race schedule, because at that point it was pretty clear that that's what we were going to see for 2022. But I just hope that the drivers and the teams and the team principals understand that it was by and large the team principals and the team owners that agreed to the 24-25 race calendar. It wasn't something that is being imposed upon them by the Liberties and the FIAs of the world. They agreed to this. They signed up for it because they're the ones in position to benefit from the additional Grand Prix, because Grand Prix bring in race sanctioning fees and they bring in additional race revenue. So ultimately, I think if anyone has a concern about a 22-23 race calendar, whether it's because it's too many races, because of the strain it puts on the teams and the drivers and the engineers and the mechanics and the factory workers, they have no one else to look at other than the people that run those teams, because they're the ones that signed up for it. And I think it's also a good opportunity to kind of revisit that topic quickly that you and I spoke to a couple of weeks ago, which is obviously when you sign up for 23 races, there's going to be a mental and a physical strain and impact on all of those involved. And one of my friends, one of our great listeners, had sent me an article from racefans.net a couple of days ago, and it kind of spoke to the fact that, hey, look, on average, an F1 team employs about 700 people. That's a big organization. Of that 700 people, about 100 of them travel to every single race. So about 14% of the team. So 100 people from every team. That's about 1,000 people from the F1 ranks that are traveling to every single race. And I've kind of been wishy-washy on this topic in the sense that, it kind of sucks that you're going to have to travel a lot and you're going to be away from your family a lot, basically half of the year. But you know what? You're doing something that you're very passionate about and you really love. So maybe you got to kind of suck it up. But at the same time, my thought is most of these folks probably realize how lucky they are and that this is something they've dreamed about and worked towards for their entire life. And if Liberty came forward with the teams and said, we're going to race a 50 race schedule, they're probably just going to suck it up and do it. So maybe it's one of those situations where a lot of these folks aren't comfortable even speaking up because they know they're in, I don't want to say a privileged position, but they're doing something that they probably recognize hundreds of thousands of other people doing similar lines of work would kill to have the opportunity to do, and probably just aren't willing to risk that by being too vocal and too inquisitive about why they're being signed up for that. So I feel for everybody involved. That said, there's a lot of industries that obviously travel a lot or on the road a lot. People work on rigs and they work at camps in the far north or in the far south and all kinds of other places. But I just hope that the teams are open to having conversations with the staff that travel and even the staff back at the factories about what their experiences are and how this could impact their quality of life and their mental health and their well-being and their relationships with their family. Another quick note, just because we're kind of on the topic, next year, Indy is scheduled to race 17 times between February 27th and September 11th. All of those races, of course, in the continental US, except for the one trip to Canada. NASCAR, the NASCAR Cup Series, races 31 times in the regular season next year, heading into the playoffs. So again, the travel's not as strenuous, but there are other racing series that see tremendous strains on their drivers. I think what really makes F1 unique is the sheer amount of mileage that the teams put on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it really is a different thing. I mean, sort of traveling around the continental United States, although that's not a small thing to kind of turn your nose up at. I mean, that is, quite demanding for all the people that are involved in those series. But I mean, Formula One is crisscrossing the globe multiple times throughout the year. And I can't help but wonder if at some point the cost of the human capital might become a little bit too much, and we'll see where it goes. Anyways, let's take a break here. When we come back, still plenty of news to talk about. And then because it is kind of like I know Casual Fridays is a thing. I don't know what the equivalent for a movie.
All of my Fridays are casual. Even if my boss doesn't know, they're all casual.
You better hope your boss is not listening. So anyways, leaving it there, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a moment, so don't go away. Okay, well, welcome back to the show and moving right along. So last week we were talking, and this has become almost, what do you want to call it, a favorite kind of like pet subject here on the show, and the possibility of the VW group entering into Formula One, which just seems like it's going to happen at some point, almost sooner rather than later with all the news that's been percolating up and bubbling up to the surface over the past weeks and months. Anyways, one of the places, or one of the teams that we thought that might be a possible landing spot for either as a customer team or perhaps as a works team would be Sauber. And so anyways, Andretti Andretti Autosport is in possible takeover talks with the Sauber team. And of course, well, Sauber, they are, I guess, the owner operators of Alfa Romeo, which, of course, is more of a naming thing rather than anything more than anything else. But apparently, Andretti Autosport is closing in on a deal that would take a majority stake of ownership in the team. And apparently, these talks are at a very advanced stage of discussion. So this is very, very interesting. I mean, Michael Andretti is obviously he's a team owner. He's a former IndyCar driver. He's the son of 1978 Formula One world champ Mario Andretti. He raced in Formula One for McLaren way back in the 90s. So it is, I think this is an exciting development. I think this is, I think this is a really cool thing.
It was a good opportunity for me to go back and revisit the careers of both Michael Andretti and his father, Mario Andretti.
Yep.
I forgot just how rich their driving histories were. And to put this in perspective,
it's crazy. It's amazing.
Mario Andretti raced in Formula One from 1968 to 1982, winning the Formula One World Championship, the World Drivers' Championship in 1978, the last American driver to do so. His son Michael Andretti, raced in Indy from 1983 to 2002, winning a title in 1991. He also spent a year with the McLaren team in 1993. And Mario Andretti raced in Indy from 1979 to 1994. So the two of them spent almost a decade sharing the same track in the same championship. It's unbelievable. Both are champions. They have a huge legacy in American motorsports. Obviously, Michael has been absolutely the backbone of Andretti Autosport, which it itself has been hugely successful. They've won the Indianapolis 500 5 times in 2005, 7, 14, 16, 17. They've won the IndyCar Series Championship in 04, 05, 07, 12. Teams won the Indy Lights Championship 08, 09, 18, 19. They've been hugely successful. Now, having said all of that, I'm going to throw out a hot take. I think this is a terrible deal for Sauber if it's anywhere in the ballpark that it's being speculated. So earlier this year, the Andretti family set up what's called a Special Purpose Acquisition Company, a SPAC, this year intended to raise about $250 million through an initial public offering, an IPO. Their expectation is that they could probably purchase a Formula One team for $200 million. If they can do that, all the power in the world to them. But if I am Sauber, there is no world, there's no reality in which case I'm selling my team for $200 million, $300 million, or even $400 million. The average value of an NBA team is north of $2 billion. The average value of an NFL team is roughly $4 billion. The average value of an NHL team is now almost $1 billion. If I'm able to pick up a Formula One team when the sport is at the absolute bottom of what should be a very, very, very powerful upward financial trajectory, if I can pick up a team for $200 or $300 or $400 million, I'm going to do it. But if I'm Sauber, why am I selling now? Why am I selling with the Volkswagen Auto Group just starting to sniff around, with potentially other OEMs starting to sniff around? And if Liberty can sign up a couple of other big TV networks and get a couple of other big sponsors in, if they can sustain this growth, this popularity, the surge in interest for another couple of years, the valuation of these individual teams will continue to skyrocket. I think this is a bad time to sell, unless, and you make a great point, it's reported that these conversations, these talks are pretty advanced. Maybe the offer to Sauber was just so significant that, like, hey, we're listening. You've piqued our interest. We've never seen an offer. Because the other conversation I have is, Sauber's been involved in motorsports for an eternity.
Yeah.
Why now? Why at this stage do they want to move on? Obviously, we've seen tremendous independence in terms of their relationship with Ferrari. It's very clear that they're not going to be keeping Antonio Giovinazzi, who Ferrari is very invested in them keeping for that Italian linkage and because he's one of their driver academy products. It's speculated that perhaps the reason that Alfa Romeo, the Sauber team, hasn't named their second driver is because the Andretti Autosports team would want to have some say in that decision. But unless it is an absolutely blockbuster deal, I think this is a bad move for Sauber, but it's also a bad deal for F1 because if Sauber signs up to a lowball offer, it brings down the valuations of all the other teams in the sport. So if it's a big offer, awesome. Welcome to Formula One. Andretti, you are going to kill it relative to your other American peer. And then I think my last comment on this one is people keep saying, hey, F1 needs another American team. There's no American team in F1 today. Don't you dare call Haas an American team. They may have an owner who's based in the US. He's using this team merely to leverage the Haas automation branding. He's not doing anything for American motorsports. He didn't start an academy. He's not investing in American drivers. He's done nothing to grow Formula One in the US. This, to me, would be the first American Formula One team. And I'm, to your point, excited to see it if it's the right deal.
Yeah, I have nothing further to add on your comments about Haas. I totally agree with that. My thoughts on what you're saying just about Sauber themselves, like if this is going to happen and why now? I've just kind of had the feeling that Sauber's almost been hanging on for the past several years. I mean, let's remember going back not all that long ago, this is a team that barely squeaked through into the modern era, had a 2017 car with a 2016 engine, and I mean, they were just puttering around at the back of the grid.
Great call.
And I can't help but feel that had they not had that injection of that the Alfa Romeo money and that branding deal, that perhaps they might have disappeared. And I kind of feel that they've maybe stewarding is maybe not the best way to say, like stewarding like a Formula One team and kind of keeping the seat warm. But I kind of have the feeling that when I've read and kind of listened about this whole Andretti situation is that I think that they were prepared to wait for a certain amount of time, and maybe after Liberty came on board, maybe they start to see some positive things happening, that maybe they've got some line drawn in the sand that if we can recover this much X dollars in a sale, then we take it and then we just cash out of the sport. So I don't know. We will wait and see, how this happens, whether that Andretti takes over the team outright or they become a majority stakeholder or whatever it may be. But that's just that's my thoughts on the subject.
That's a really great counterpoint in the sense that, hey, for this team, they inherited it, they purchased it at a fraction of what even its minimal valuation could be. It's all upside for them. And the other consideration too here is maybe that team is nursing some pretty significant debt and they could wait out for a bigger value or kind of valuation, but their debt could simply continue to balloon and offset any of those gains anyway. So for them, maybe there's an opportunity here, an all cash deal. They can tap out, they can pay off their debt, move on. Maybe they can focus on other motorsports ventures, but I think you've presented a really good counterpoint there.
But you made a really good point as well, and I think that if I'm the Daimler-Benz group or I'm Ferrari or one of these sort of really top-tier Formula One teams, I'm a little bit salty. I'm a little bit grouchy if Sauber's selling for bargain basement prices. When especially when you're Daimler-Benz and you've invested billions and billions, and of course you've won like 45 championships in a row, or at least it seems that way over the past 45 championships in 10 years. I don't do math for a living, no. But
the final.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that the final point as well on this one is it's not just necessarily the teams, because I have some sources on the inside, as I think most great podcasters do, whether they're real or not, but we have some sources on the inside that are very clear that Formula One is very eager to add two teams to the grid. And it would be structured very much like an expansion team in the NBA or the NHL. It sounds like Liberty would keep some of the money and distribute some of the money to the other teams, because in doing so, you compromise the amount of championship money that might be eligible to teams, because it's understood that no team is going to sign up in the current era if they're not able to access championship money. And currently only teams that finish in the top 10 have access to championship money. So if you finish 11th or 12th, you're not cashing in any dollars. But the reason that Formula One is eager to add teams is because they're desperate to offset the $1 billion of revenue they lost in 2020. So there's some urgency from Formula One to add some teams to the grid. And all of a sudden, if Sauber sells for a dirt cheap valuation, then all of a sudden it compromises potentially what Liberty might be able to sell a couple of expansion teams for.
I was just thinking that, if you're going to treat it like an expansion team, can we have an expansion draft? And if so, could we draft like Dennis Rodman too, like that? I mean, is Dennis still, is he like okay, or is he persona non grata?
He's around. He's making the podcast rounds. He's pretty funny.
I was just kind of wondering because, a couple of years ago, he did kind of have that link to a certain Far East Asian dictatorship and teaching a certain person. But, whatever, so we'll kind of leave that aside. But hey, Dennis, if you want to come on our show, I mean, it'd be awesome. Anyhow, moving along, talking about other well-known sporting personalities, and I think this is awesome. Danica Patrick, a legendary U.S. racing driver, is going to be joining the Sky Sports F1 team for the US Grand Prix at COTA this weekend. And I think this is awesome. I think it's pretty cool how they've had these guest hosts over the course of this season. And I know that and I'm not suggesting that you have any sort of anything less than a positive opinion of Danica Patrick, but just talking about Nico Rosberg, you were not a fan of his at all until he came on and started doing some of these guest commentary spots this year. And I think, that you've actually flipped your opinion on that. And I really like what they've done that. And I'm really excited to see Danica in the booth this weekend and contributing to this race.
So yes, you're absolutely right. I was not a big Nico fan, and I started softening up to him that weekend when he was in the booth with the Sky Sports team. And then by almost accident, I ended up watching some of his vlogging material on YouTube. And my initial sense was, he's biting at the style of all these young amateur YouTubers. But as I watched the video, I'm like, this is actually pretty sincere. This is pretty authentic. And I really fell in love with the quality of his material. And I've sat through a couple of the videos where he takes people on tours of tracks, like he takes people on the sim with them. I've learned quite a lot. He's actually a great personality. And I was all for him disappearing from the Formula One ecosystem in 2017. But back to Danica Patrick. So unknown story. I was a huge Danica Patrick fan when she emerged in IRL back in the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. And it was bittersweet for me because it was a celebration of a woman breaking through into a top tier open wheel racing series. The problem was I was hugely anti-IRL because I was a big Champ Car guy. And there was these two competing forces.
Right.
But good news, in a sense, Champ Car was eventually gobbled up by IRL, and a few of its events ended up on the IRL calendar, including Toronto and including Edmonton. So I drove overnight 11 hours from Vancouver to Edmonton in 2009 in the blistering heat to see Danica Patrick live. And this speaks to just how transcendent of a talent that she was even back then, that I drove with one of my best friends 11, 12, 13 hours through the night to get to Edmonton to be able to see her live, because I have this bucket list of all these great athletes I wanted to be able to see perform live, whether it was Shaquille O'Neal or Dwayne Wade or Kevin Durant or any of these great NHLers or any of these great Major League Baseball players. And I've managed to see them all, but Danica Patrick was one of the ones that was on my bucket list. So I did actually manage to see her in 2009. Back then, you were able to get much closer to the drivers in the paddock. So I got within a few feet, didn't get to meet her, didn't get to speak to her, but got a couple of great photos of her. Mm-hmm. She was a rock star, and it's hard to explain just how transcendent and how big she was in the 2000s. Obviously, the money and just how lucrative NASCAR was at the time. She was drawn into NASCAR. So her IndyCar career ended, I think, in around 2011, if I recall. So she moved over to the NASCAR series. And I kind of lost track of her at that point because I've never been the biggest NASCAR fan, although I think you and I are committed to doing a NASCAR episode at one point where we watch a race live and comment on it. But she's transcendent, and I cannot wait to hear her in the booth. I think that's going to be a total blast.
Yeah, just going to what you were saying there, there is that she moved over to NASCAR in 2013, and I think she only stopped racing relatively recently. I think maybe as recent as 2017 or 2018. But yeah, she was a fantastic driver, and just can't wait to hear her in the booth and all the context and perspective and knowledge that she brings. But talking about some of these things, you were talking about all these legendary players and personalities that you wanted to see. You mentioned Shaq in there. I have to ask, do you have a copy of Shaq Fu around in your house there? I mean, you have to. Come on.
I don't have a copy of Shaq Fu. I never had a 16-bit gaming console on which it was released. I think it was available for Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. But I should say there's an entire episode of that really hilarious sitcom, Fresh Off the Boat, I think it's called. But there's a whole episode about the Shaq Fu video game, which I thought was hilarious.
That's awesome. I got to check this one out. Okay, let's take a quick break, and when we come back on the flip side, and Danica's already weighed in ahead of the US Grand Prix and saying that she wants to see an American driver in F1, and we'll reveal who her pick is to make it to the bigger leagues, I suppose. I mean, compared to where he is already. And we'll do so in just a moment. So don't go away. We'll be right back. All right, and welcome back to the podcast. It is always up to speed with Formula One. Mark and Mark, Daly and Hamilton, talking about the latest F1 news. And we're going to jump into the mailbag in a little while here. We've been collecting the tweets and the emails, and we got some really good ones that we want to talk about here in a little bit. Anyways, before the break, I just mentioned, and we just talked quite a bit about Danica Patrick, legendary personality and racing driver in the booth this weekend for the US Grand Prix. And Danica was saying just the other day that she really wants to see a US driver in Formula One. And this is maybe not a surprise, because this is the same fellow that was, I think, tapped on the shoulder or given Mario Andretti's blessing just a couple of months ago. And that is IndyCar star Colton Herta. What do you think of this, Mark?
I like this one, and I've become a big fan of Colton Herta, less I think because of his on-track performance, which is very, very strong, but rather I just like his personality. He's a laid-back, fun California kid. I think he embodies so much of America in his personality. He's approachable, he's accessible, he works hard on the track, he's ultra racy. I think he would be a great kid. And the other linkage, which kind of ties into the story that you and I were speaking to a couple of minutes ago, is the fact that he's racing for Andretti Autosport in the IndyCar series. So there's already a linkage there. So I think when I was alluding to a couple of moments ago, which is, hey, possibly the reason that Sauber Alfa Romeo haven't announced their second driver is part of the purchase agreement could be contingent on them having a say on the seat. Now, of course, there's all kinds of obstacles to overcome in terms of getting Colton his super license and getting him some Formula One reps, but I think he would be a great kid. Now, that said, he's young. He's the youngest IndyCar driver to ever win a race. He's only 18, 19 years old. Even if he continued to mature and get reps in IndyCar for another year or two, he's still going to enter Formula One at an incredibly young age, if that's the path he wants to pursue. But I think he would be a great fit for F1, and he would be a marketing bonanza for Liberty and whatever team he ultimately ends up landing with.
Well, I'm going to just sort of step in here, Mark, because surprisingly, Colton is a little bit older than you actually may have not realized. He's actually 21, which, so that kind of, I wouldn't say kind of has the clock ticking for him, but I think that, if you want to get into Formula One and that opportunity is there, I think it's kind of an interesting age because, he's not super young. He's not really super old, but certainly, it's just like, how much time do you want to, if that opportunity is there, do you want to let that slip through to get some more experience racing in IndyCar? I think it's a bit of a tough call. I think most drivers would probably jump at that opportunity, but certainly he's not really, he kind of presents and looks a little bit younger than he actually is, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I appreciate you correcting me on air as opposed to afterwards when we get a flurry of angry DMs correcting me. So I appreciate that. But you're right, 18's one thing, 19's another, 2021. Well, you know what? That's the point at which most kids are graduating into Formula One from Formula 2, and obviously Nicholas Latifi was a bit of an exception because he started so much later and because he was so well financed, and it was still the right fit for Williams at the time, and it continues to appear to be an even better fit because he's developed so significantly this year. But 2021, that's when you need to be looking to make that jump, because for every year that you continue to age, there's other kids coming up through the lower formulas that are younger and just as talented and cheaper and potentially even more moldable. So yeah, you're right. 21 looks like he debuted in Indy, and I think most of our listeners probably are well aware of this, but broke through at the very end of 2018, raced in 2019, won 2 races last year, raced in 2020 in the abbreviated season, won a race there. This year finished 5th in the championship versus 3rd in 2020, winning 3 races, including the last 2 on the calendar.
Yeah, interesting, eh? So moving on to the next story, and this, I'll let you take this one, Mark, but he's not the only IndyCar driver that's linked to Formula One. And this one is kind of, I wouldn't say it's self-promotion. I mean, there's definitely a connection already there. So why don't you take this one, Mark?
I think this story breaks in a couple of directions. The first is, and I'll kind of hit this one off the top, but Arrow McLaren SP IndyCar driver Pato O'Ward says he would be lying if he denied that he had interest in a future switch to Formula One ahead of his upcoming maiden test in Abu Dhabi. And for those of you that don't remember, he and McLaren chief Zach Brown had a bet earlier this year, or had an agreement, that if he was to win a race in the IndyCar Championship this year, he would get a test in a Formula One car. Well, he won a race, and Zach Brown is coming through on his commitment. So after the season finale at Abu Dhabi in the middle of December, he's going to get to do a test at that track in a Formula One car. So he's been to Woken. He spent 3 days in the simulator, or he's going to be spending 3 days in the simulator. He's going to have to go through a seat fitment, is going to have to be equipped to be a Formula One driver for a couple of days. But when asked, he was very clear that, look, if you ask any open wheel racing driver anywhere in the world if they wished or dreamed of being in a Formula One car, they would be lying if they said no. And there's obviously a couple of reasons for this, that if you grow up dreaming of being a Formula One driver, if you grow up dreaming of being an open wheel racing car driver, you obviously dream of racing at the highest possible level, and Formula One is that level. That said, though, I think what's really interesting about this story is it speaks to and reinforces the reality that there seem to be these emerging interwoven relationships between Formula One and Indy in a way that maybe we haven't seen them before. As we know, McLaren's continued to grow its interest and its investment in the team it's partnered with in Indy for a couple of years. There's been rumors in the past that Ferrari sniffed around joining. There's rumors that Andretti Motorsport or Andretti Autosport is now looking to do the reverse, which is grow their autosport business from Indy into Formula One. And I think this is all really great news because it gives Formula One teams the opportunity to cross promote and cross merchandise in the US using teams that race there more regularly. If I'm a Formula One team, it gives me the opportunity to put younger drivers, stash them away in a really competitive series, as opposed to losing them into the abyss that is a DTM or Australian supercars. But I think it's an interesting story. And Pato O'Ward, the young Mexican driver, is another tremendous talent that has all the makings potentially of a future F1 star. The challenge once again is there's only 20 seats in F1. Those young F2 drivers always seem to have the upper hand simply because they're more familiar with the tracks. They belong to F1 driver academies, but he is a very talented young driver. Yeah,
it would be cool to see more people get the opportunity to race in Formula One. And I think it was pretty cool the way that he talked about it, the opportunity. He said that he's trying to do the perfect job that he can for in IndyCar. He wants to give the team the championship. He wants to help them win the Indy 500, but he's quite open and honest about it. And he's just like, if the opportunity that it was to come up in Formula One, that he'd absolutely love to jump at it and take it. And of course, I mean, that is logical because Formula One is still the top racing series in the world. Okay, moving along. So Petronas, the fuel supplier, is also Malaysian oil gigantopithecus or gigantosaurus, whatever you want to call it. They are a sponsor and technical partner of Mercedes, and they have been ever since Mercedes came back into Formula One way back in 2010, over a decade ago, which is a bit mind-blowing how quickly that has gone. Anyways, so obviously their branding features prominently anywhere there is Mercedes Formula Formula One cars and their drivers' overalls and anywhere. So it's heavily branded. Anyways, the deal that they've had has been extended several times in the past, and their most current contract, which they signed just a couple of years ago, runs until the end of 2025. So even though that there's a deal in place, there's been some speculation over the past week or so that Petronas would actually leave Mercedes at the end of the season, and that Mercedes would actually replace them with Saudi Arabian company Aramco as its title partner from 2022. So anyways, this is getting a little bit, there seems like there's some twists and turns all along the way. Anyways, there was a joint statement released on Monday of this week, and saying that, quote, Petronas and Mercedes have been partners since 2010 in a collaborative long-term relationship that is mutually beneficial to both parties. Last year, we extended our partnership for another multi-year cycle, and we are proud to continue working together to deliver cutting-edge performance, end quote. So there you go. So Aramco still probably going to feature as sponsors around the tracks, but maybe not getting to sponsor one of the premier Formula One teams, at least for now. So anyways, there you go.
My primary takeaway from this, and I find this a little bit amusing, is this is one of those stories that erupted and caught fire on Twitter, on F1 Twitter over the weekend. And as you start drilling in, it became pretty clear very early that there was absolutely no substance or source for the story. And I'm not criticizing or commenting on the nature of the story, but just rather the fact that there was a quote from somewhere that caught fire and it exploded on internet Twitter. And it caught fire simply because this partnership with Mercedes has been so strong and it's been dominant throughout their historically strong run here. But what's interesting is the fact that both Petronas and Mercedes had to come out and comment on the status of their relationship in reference to, or in defiance to, the internet rumors that spread over Twitter. I find it funny when something of no substance can catch fire on social media, and that the subjects of the rumor have to come out and openly address the fact that there is no substance or truth to the rumor. It's funny how social media works, and it's just funny that this could be the topic of interest for 3 or 4 days over the weekend, when really what we should be talking about is all of the teams landing in Austin for the US Grand Prix.
Internet, man, I tell you. All right, moving on to the next one. Well, we did have one that Coda's actually addressing the bumps on the track for the Grand Prix this weekend because some of the issues that they've had there with the recent MotoGP race. And I'm actually going to bump this story to Thursday's show since we want to get to the mailbag. See what I did there? But before
I like that.
Clever, right? Groans all around. I can hear it. We're going to get those angry DMs before we're done tonight. At any rate. Anyways, one story I wanted to talk about before we jump into the mailbag is Lando Norris said that openness over mental health is important to help others, and he is, spoke out about it and some of the struggles that he's had, and specifically early in his Formula One career, specifically coping with the enormous, amount of pressure that he's had to deal with as a young Formula One driver, and everything that entails. And I think this is great. I mean, I guess this kind of is a nice way to kind of bring the discussion to full circle. I mean, off the top of the show, we were talking about how it's good to see Sebastian Vettel using his stature and standing within the sport to address some of the topics and causes that he feels important. And I think it's great when you have somebody like Lando being quite up front and open and frank about such an important issue as mental health.
I agree. I think the reason there's value in Lando continuing to talk about it is because it continues to be part of the narrative and the conversation. And I think the sad reality is that most people who struggle with mental health don't know they're struggling with mental health, or maybe they suspect, but they're simply too afraid or too scared or too nervous to seek help. And I think it's also important to remember as well that mental health manifests itself in so many different ways. And I think for a lot of people in the broader community, I think sometimes the assumption when you talk about mental health is it's depression, somebody's sad. And for sure, depression is a big part of mental health, and millions of people legitimately struggle with sometimes debilitating forms of depression. But mental health can manifest itself in so many ways that you can't imagine. And sometimes some of the most capable and successful and high functioning people that surround you and are in your lives suffer incredibly under crushing, debilitating forms of mental health, but they learn to develop coping mechanisms, and they learn to find workarounds and shortcuts and best practices to manage their debilitating mental health conditions or issues. And I think it's really good when Lando Norris talks about it, because then you and I are talking about it. And then people sitting at home listening to this podcast, or out driving or out walking or out running, suddenly start thinking like, you know what, that thing that I've been struggling with since the 9th grade or the 8th grade, or since as early as I can remember, maybe I should talk to somebody about that. Because the worst possible thing that can happen is if you talk to somebody, or you talk to your family doctor, or you go to a therapist, is, you know what? Guess what? Maybe you might be able to get help, or maybe you're going to get a little bit of relief because you'll recognize that you're not the only one coping. And sometimes people that suffer with a specific type of mental health, or a specific mental health issue, sometimes force themselves to believe that it's unique and it's specific to them, and they're the only one in the world that's suffering in that way. And as a result, nobody can help them. You can get help, and people want to help you. It's taking that first step and reaching out for help. And that's not always a healthcare professional. It's sometimes just talking to a friend or a colleague or a coworker, and initiating that journey. And like we've said before, you, me, we're both open. Reach out at any time. I promise you, if you reach out, I'll pick up the phone and I will call you and we can have a conversation.
Yeah, totally. And this is something that's important to me, because anxiety and depression is something that I've dealt with and lived through, and it sucks. And, I'm in a much better place now, but it is tough. And sometimes just making that first step to getting help it's a difficult thing to do. And it's a very, very rough thing to deal with. Anyways, let's move along now. Let's take a quick break here. We'll come back and we'll talk. Actually, we're going to not talk about anything. We're going to address all the emails and tweets that we have. So we're going to talk. We're just not going to talk about the news. We'll talk about the emails, and we'll do so in just a moment. So don't go away. We'll be right back. All right. Well, welcome back. I feel like that we should have like some sort of like, we've got a MotoGP corner jingle, which is gathering cobwebs and dust here in the corner, considering you've kind of let us down here the last several weeks. But I feel like we should have months. Yeah, maybe it actually has been months, but we should have like a Mailbag Monday jingle. So maybe we should do that at some point. So why don't we jump into let's go to Twitter first of all, because we always know that Twitter's an awesome, happy place that nothing bad ever happens there. I'm being totally, except in our community, because F1 fans are the greatest, specifically our community around this podcast. Yep. So first one is from Aaron Lewis. Aaron's question is, why doesn't F1 have relegation like they have in European soccer? Why doesn't the FIA have their own streaming service for all the FIA races? I know Liberty owns F1 and their streaming rights, but it just makes more sense to have an overall streaming service for multiple races, race types, and they could use the revenue sharing like the MLB, Major League Baseball, uses. Thank you. Keep up the good work, Mark Squared. So relegation, like they have in European soccer, that would be kind of interesting. And it would kind of suck if you were Williams or McLaren and some of the other teams. I mean, especially how far and how quickly they fell off and fell down into the abyss and are slowly clawing their way back. If you're Williams and if you're McLaren, actually winning some races and making some good positive news. That is something I've never actually thought about. But I guess because the sport just isn't structured that way, and it would be maybe disincentivizing for teams if there was that sort of financial penalty. I mean, it'd be much, as much as you might say hate the Dallas Cowboys. If you're Jerry Jones and your team gets relegated because you went 2-14 over the years, you'd be very, angry that your team has now been relegated to NFL 2. And I would think that, or whatever it could be, I think that'd be very much like,
CFL.
CFL, right? And then as far as the streaming service for FI race, races. I know that F1 TV Pro, or just F1 TV in general, is a huge leap forward. I mean, admittedly, I think they've got a long way to go, but it is interesting too, because I mean, if you want to watch something like Le Mans, or you want to watch F2 or Formula One, it doesn't matter what it is, that's anything FIA sanctioned, it's not always easy to find, or DTM, whatever whatever you're searching for. But I don't know if it's a licensing thing, maybe it's a logistical thing, maybe it's all of the above. But I would just be happy if they could iron out all the wrinkles that they have with the streaming service for Formula One as it is right now. I mean, they've made a good start. I love to see them finally fill out that historical archive, and just have things like native Apple TV apps, and just make it a little bit. I mean, it's getting close, but it still isn't completely seamless in terms of like the viewing experience. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think the F1 TV Pro app has grown exponentially in terms of its functionality and its stability from early last year, where it crashed multiple times during the first few races and you missed entire chunks of Grand Prix. It's gotten better. I do like the concept of having a singular app or app ecosystem that captures multiple race series. Admittedly, I'm not at a place in my life where I can enjoy more than one championship at a time, so I'm content with just F1, but I get it. I like the idea of being able to bring them all into a single platform, because it would increase exposure, it would give people an opportunity to see race series they might not otherwise go and see. In response to Aaron's first question, I'll make this quick. It's never going to happen, and it's never going to happen because the only way it could is if they restructured the championship. All of the teams would have to agree in the future Concord agreement to some form of relegation. Why would any existing team ever sign up for it? It's the same reason it would never happen in the NBA, the NHL, Major League Baseball, or the NFL. You could never incentivize those teams to sign up for a championship or structure the leagues in such a way that they could risk being relegated, because if you're relegated, well, your gate revenue is going to collapse, your TV revenue is going to collapse, and your sponsorship revenue is going to collapse. The same thing would happen in Formula One. And let's be very clear that a lot of the teams in F1 don't make money today. None of the teams in Formula 2 or Formula 3 make money. They are marketing exercises. They're heavily subsidized by the teams in Formula 1. They don't make a ton of money. So if I'm Williams or I'm Haas and I risk being relegated, well, my entire existence could disappear. And then on the flip side, if I'm a Formula 2 team that's getting promoted, well, I could never be competitive simply because I don't have the resources, the people capital, or the infrastructure to compete with a team that's established in the championship. To your earlier point, you would have to completely restructure not just Formula 1, but Formula 2 and Formula 3 in such a way that all the teams are much more consistently structured, and that's never going to happen. Ferrari will never sign up for a championship where one bad season could bounce them into a lower formula.
Yeah, that would literally see the entire motorsport world implode if that ever happened to Ferrari. But great question. Next one comes from Polly, and the question is, what tips can you give a new podcaster, and what's the hardest part about doing a podcast? Thanks for doing such a great show every single week. Well, thank you for those kind words, Polly. Hardest thing about doing a podcast every week is sitting down with Mark Hamill. I mean, no.
We're on the air.
No, when it comes to doing a podcast, it's just really, committing to it and saying that I'm going to do a show that comes out monthly, weekly, every 2 weeks. So whatever it is, whatever works for you, stick to that schedule. Also, know what you're talking about. It doesn't matter if you're talking about Formula One or basket weaving or politics. Just know your subject. And then when it comes down to things like just audio equipment, it doesn't need to be fancy. I mean, you can get a really decent mic for really relatively inexpensively nowadays, and you can get recording software that is either like GarageBand if you have a Mac. I mean, there's plenty of like freeware, shareware out there that's good, not loaded with viruses, and it's just learning a little bit of the production side. I mean, you can get royalty free music where you don't have to be like some huge uber rich media corporation, so you can have the rights to Lady Gaga or whatever, right? For your theme music. So you can do it quite modestly, and it's just and the thing is just to practice. When I first got back into podcasting almost a decade ago now, my friend and I, Jorge, we sat down and we probably recorded half a dozen episodes that we never released. We just did them. We went through the whole process. We listened to them, and we realized how terrible we were. And then eventually we got to the point after doing 4 or 5, whatever it was, we actually decided to release one. And then from that point, there was no looking back. It actually was better received than we ever thought it would be. And it was started, a wonderful journey that he and I went on for a number of years, and then started this parallel project. And this has become an equally enjoyable and rewarding and fun experience that you and I are now on, which is awesome.
I think the only feedback, and I think everything you said is totally valid in terms of the gear. And again, you don't have to spend a ton of money, but having a good mic, and they cost about $100, having a good headset, lots of experimentation, license your music, but audio quality makes a big difference because there are so many professionally produced podcasts out there that if somebody gives your podcast a try and there's popping and there's buzzing and there's hissing and it's clearly been recorded through a laptop microphone, your listeners are going to say, clearly this person didn't make an effort, so why should I try? So you don't have to spend a lot of money, but you do have to dial in your audio quality. And if people give you feedback that is problematic, you got to listen to them and adjust accordingly. I think the only other feedback that I would have is don't get discouraged. I think sometimes people look at the immediate success of podcasts like Call Her Daddy, which goes from, a couple listeners to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of listeners within a couple of months. Sometimes that happens. For the millions of other podcasts, that's not what happens. So don't get discouraged. Set yourself some reasonable targets and be happy when you hit them. Look, you know what? After a month, I want to get 50 downloads with 60% consumption. After 6 months, I want to be at 100 downloads. After a year, I want to be at 200 downloads. But be reasonable, because if you go in there with expectations that you're going to get 1,000 downloads after your first episode, you are going to be crushingly disappointed. You're going to be discouraged, and then you're going to produce podcasts less frequently, which is only going to kill the algorithms and the likelihood that you're going to be able to build momentum. And I remember one of the things that I learned the first time around with my last F1 podcast was, you know what, I had these high expectations that, hey, we're going to do X number. And you know what, it took 2 years to get to 1,000 downloads per episode. And I was just crushed. Like I felt like I was doing everything in the world, but I couldn't get there. And it's funny because early on I was like, I'm going to be happy with 100. I'm like, I would be thrilled with 500. But I get to 1,000 and I'm like, well, that's not good enough. I need 10,000. But we're in a position now where this show does numbers that are just astronomical compared to anything I could ever have imagined years ago. And we know, and this is a bit of a humble flex, but we know we're probably the second biggest North American-based podcast. But what I do now is we don't look at the numbers. We just dial in, we do a great show, and we engage with the audience. And that's enough. If you look at the numbers and if you look at the analytics, you're going to become paralyzed because you're going to be looking at something that you really don't have a lot of control over if you're A, engaging with your audience, and you're 2, putting in a great show every week on a consistent basis.
Yeah, exactly. And then commit to a minimum amount of time, 6 months or a year or something, and then get out there and promote it on social media, be it Twitter, Facebook, whatever your preferred social media platform is. But another great question. Next one comes from Janice Porter, and Janice's question and comment is, we hear about lots about Hamilton's family, quote, or in brackets, self-promotion, as he says jokingly, but never anything about Daly. Does Daly have kids as well? Even though I'm in the UK, you are my favorite F1 podcast, Gen TTS. Yeah, so I do have kids. I have 3 kids, 2 sons and a daughter. Daughter's in the middle. And they're great. They're all awesome kids. My oldest just went into grade 8. My daughter just went into middle school. We put them in French immersion because we thought that would be a good academic challenge, and they seem to be doing that, doing pretty good there. And my youngest son just went into to grade 1, and they're all great kids, all very active. My son just started sailing, racing on a sailing team this year. My daughter's a competitive cheerleader, which she's been doing for a couple of years, which she loves. And my youngest son, he loves Transformers and superheroes and everything awesome that like 6-year-olds love. And, I'm a 6-year-old at heart, so I just love all that stuff too. So that thanks for that one, Janice. Next one is from
Twee.
Okay, thank you. I was going to mispronounce it and apologize ahead of time. So thanks for saving me there. So the question is, can you kindly recommend some F1 themed Christmas gifts with Christmas season fast approaching? My boyfriend and I fell in love with F1 Gen TTS, and I'd love to keep his gifts on brand. Great show and keep up the great work. So, caveat here is, if you think that you're going to get away and spend, $100 on Formula One themed Christmas presents, double that, or at least, because that's going to get up to say $250 really quickly. If you're North America, I mean, if it's euros or pounds or whatever, I mean, it's it's all going to be relative. But I mean, there's some great things out there. I'm a hat guy, so I always like to get I don't buy an F1 hat every year. I have to get select ones. One that really blows me away, that it becomes a must-have, and I probably have, half a dozen, 7, 8 in the collection, going back probably 15, 20 years or so. So maybe not every year, every couple of years, but they have to stand out. I mean, the scale models, I guess, what are they, 1/18 scale? They're awesome, extremely detailed, but they can get a little bit pricey. There's some other cool merch out there, some the things that I really like, and I don't have any, but some things that I really regret I didn't get it when I was at the Spanish Grand Prix a couple of years ago, was like a quarter zip Mercedes, like it was like not really a fleece top, a sweater, but it was really cool. It had all the the logos on it, and everything was black with that sort of minty green Patronus color on there, which was really, really awesome. Things like that. I mean, if you want to go even to another level, you can go to authentic car parts, which I know you have something close at hand. But again, if you're looking for a little widget or a barge board or something like that, I mean, that can be big money. But I mean, you can still pick up some small bits and pieces for a couple of $100 here and there. And of course, video games, F1, the official video game, is relatively I don't think it's all that expensive. What does it run, about maybe $75 Canadian? So maybe about 65 US, and maybe roughly the same in pounds or euros. So that's quite affordable if gaming's your thing. Anything to add there, Mark?
Just a couple of things. One, obviously, Race Weekend Magazine, a subscription for $100 for 4 coffee table-sized issues without advertisements.
Yes,
that is a no-brainer.
Yep.
And for those of you that don't know, which is probably everyone, because we've never talked about this before, we may or may not be in negotiations to rebrand our studio as the Race Weekend Studios, so stay tuned for that. And then I think the only other piece, too, is F1 TV Pro subscription. I think that's a great gift. Both of you can enjoy that. And then finally, there's a local artist in our neck of the woods called David Tyers, and he does some absolutely beautiful Formula One prints. I'll tweet out his work, but I would highly recommend you take a look at that. And then just a comment on what you said a couple of minutes ago, less related to the question, but quarter zip fleece. Tell me you're a dad without telling me you're a dad if that gets you excited. A quarter zip fleece.
No further comment to add there. I am guilty as charged. Okay, next one comes from William Louis. I saw your photography on Instagram after you kept talking about it on the podcast, and it's amazing. Can you share your secrets and your gear? Any best practices for shooting at the track? You and Shift F1 are my favorite podcasts, period. Awesome. Thanks, William. So take it away, sir.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I love this question. And for those of you that don't know, which is probably nobody because I talk about this all the time, I absolutely adore Formula One photography, and I've had the opportunity to shoot now at a couple of tracks. I think the first thing to understand is that if you're planning to go to a track and shoot photography-wise, make sure you know whether the track will allow you to bring in your gear in advance. I've been delighted in the past, and I've also been greatly disappointed when I get to the gates and I can't or can bring in your gear. So know in advance. The good news is, for a lot of our listeners in the US, COTA allows you to bring in all your gear. They didn't in 2012. There was a huge backlash. You can now. Silverstone you can, Belgium you can, Spain you can, France you can. So most of the Western European tracks. So the good news is you can bring in all your gear. What I would recommend is spend a lot of time looking at the track on Google Street View, get a sense of the lay of the land, understand where you can go. If you've got really great seats in the grandstand, you can shoot from there, but just understand that sometimes that can be distracting and uncomfortable for the people sitting around you. My personal recommendation is to scout locations on Google Street View and head to them in advance. And typically I'm talking about general admission areas because depending on the track, sometimes you can get some absolutely fantastic non-obstructed views of the track from general admission areas. So for me, typically what I would do is I would be there super early on the day of Saturday. So typically I wouldn't shoot during the race because I want to watch the race, but typically I'll shoot on Saturday. So I'm able to shoot free practice 3 and qualifying. So typically I would scout a really great location, an unobstructed view location from the general admission area. I get there a couple of hours early. I'm the first one in the gates. I hightail it to the location. And then once I'm there, I stake out my spot. The keys to be successful are 1, have a camera with the fastest memory card you can because you're going to shoot as fast as that camera possibly can. If you have a slow memory card, it's going to cut down on the number of shots you're going to be able to take. Take a monopod because you will be exhausted after holding a big lens, a big zoom for a couple of hours. Take the longest lens you can. Now, my recommendation here is key. The best lenses for photography at a sporting event like Formula One is a fast prime or a fast zoom. They are incredibly expensive, so consider renting one because you probably won't use it a lot outside of Formula One. Buy a great body, rent a fast zoom. That's probably the most economical way to do it. And like I said, make sure you have a monopod. I've often taken my laptop so I can actually look at photos on the go to make sure I've dialed in my settings, my exposure, my shutter speed quickly enough. And then the other benefit of getting there early too is you can shoot for some of the support series to dial in and get ready for free practice 3. So those would probably be my recommendation. And then the only other thing I would recommend is you can actually practice at home on the street, go to a busy intersection, go to the highway, pan, take shots. And that's the other cool thing you can try as well is panning. Take a UV filter, slow down that shutter speed and practice panning, but do that before you get to the track because it can be a acquired art and something that you need to practice and get that muscle memory in. But yeah, that's just some of my best practices, but have fun.
Awesome. Okay. Next one comes from Matt, the captain. This one's cool. Solution to sprint qualifying. Friday qualifying sets the GP grid. It sets a reverse grid for the sprint. Top 5 in the sprint gets points. Now it's a standalone, but also gives us the reverse grid we all want without hurting the Grand Prix on Sunday. I think there's something to this. I like it.
Do you like the idea? So I'm going to be honest, full disclosure, people talk about reverse grid all the time. Yep. I hate it. I even hate in the NBA that there's a draft lottery. I don't like the fact that we reward poor performance. I hate the fact that a team like the Philadelphia 76ers, and I apologize to our new friend at Race Weekend Magazine for this. I'm not going to say his name because I don't want to put him on blast, but I hate the fact that the Philadelphia 76ers were rewarded for being so intentionally terrible for so long. You know what? If you're a great team and you win a championship, why should you be punished in the NBA draft? And I get why they do it for parity, all those kind of things, but I just hate the fact that there could be a race for points that penalizes teams that do especially well. So I don't like it. So this isn't a criticism of the question because I think it's an awesome question. I just want to be clear that my opinion on reverse grids, even though I am in the absolute minority, is I just don't like them. I would love to hear your opinion because you and I haven't talked about this before.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one because I think that we do need to spice up like the sprint race on Saturday. I mean,
that I agree
think
with.
We're all done with the whole concept of calling it sprint qualifying because it's not qualifying, it's a sprint race. And I think that there has to be some way to really incentivize the drivers to go out there and try and get a good result because it seems that, we've seen sprint qualifying or sprint sessions that are like between 15 and 20 laps in length. So, it seems after you get to about like lap 10, it sort of gets really sedate, it gets really sleepy, and everybody's just trying to get around without damaging the car, driving into one another, and it very quickly becomes boring. So why I'm not really a big fan of the whole concept of reverse grids, but this I find quite intriguing, because I think it really is a bit of a different twist to what we've seen before, where we have the reverse grid to say start the Grand Prix, which I'm totally against. But if you have say you take Friday qualifying and you use that to set the grid for Saturday, but also to set the race for set the grid for Sunday, but also to set the grid for the sprint race on Saturday. I think that's fascinating as well, and I like the idea. Flip it to the back. So say Lewis or Max qualifies on pole. So sure, they got the pole on Sunday, but if you're starting at the back of the grid on Saturday, maybe instead of being whatever 30%, maybe you make it closer to say 40, 45, 50% of race distance. Put the contenders at the back, and then, especially in a close championship, you get into later in the year, those points become a lot more valuable. I mean, you couldn't tell me that we're going to see sprint qualifying here in a couple of weeks in Brazil, right? That Max and Lewis wouldn't be going all out as hard as they could, relative to one another. I guess the one wrinkle in that one is that if the two say, or however drivers might be involved in a championship battle, if one of them, or they just decide, we're not going to risk it, we're just going to sit at the back and let somebody else go for the points, then maybe that's the bit of the asterisk to that. But I think it's got there's some merit to it for sure.
Mark, you just made a really great point, which is, we've talked a lot this year about the approach, the psychological, philosophical, tactical approach that teams have had to the sprint qualifying sessions, in the sense that, look, why are we going to go toe-to-toe, wheel-to-wheel in these events? There's minimal points available. Ultimately, we could wreck our car, have significantly impact the cost cap, put our mechanics in a position where they're going to be up all night fighting curfew to get this car ready for Sunday. What if we damage the gearbox? What if we damage the power unit? We've got to swap it out. We take a penalty. There's a lot of negatives, I think, from a team's perspective, simply because there's so few points in the balance. I wonder now how Mercedes and Red Bull in particular approach sprint qualifying in Brazil, because on the one hand, they're only separated by a couple of points, and it could be that the championship swings around, it could be that they're tied, it could be that they're 1 or 2 points aside. We could go into Brazil, that sprint qualifying weekend, and they could be head to head. Do you then go all out in sprint qualifying, know that all of those points matter, and that, if you secure those 3 points for finishing at the front in sprint qualifying? Or do you look at it like, look, we have nothing to gain and everything to lose in sprint qualifying? If I'm Mercedes, do I make the decision that, look, we're just going to hang back, we are not going to fight wheel to wheel, we're going to let somebody else take those points? Because if Hamilton gets tangled up and we damage his car, or he gets a damaged gearbox, do we compromise the Grand Prix the next day, where potentially we could score 25 points? I just think, to your earlier point, they haven't built enough incentive into sprint qualifying to make it meaningful. Like, you and I talk about every point matters, but competing in sprint qualifying in Brazil with the championship this close could be more risky than it could propose or pose a reward. Do you know what I mean? Am I making sense?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. But the thing that I like about this tweet is that I think it's got us talking and thinking about sprint qualifying in a completely different way compared to where we were, even at the beginning of this discussion, especially compared to where we were a month ago when we've been discussing it. And I think this is exactly the sort of mentality, the kind of thought process that Formula One is going to need to do to really find like that, that perfect mix, that perfect balance to get the sprint qualifying correct. So I think it's a great observation. Hey, let's take a quick break, one final break here. When we come back, we had a couple really good emails, so we'll get to those in just a moment. So don't go away. We'll be right back. All right, well, welcome back to the show. Last segment here, but still some really good things to talk about. This is one that we talked about briefly, I think on the last show. This is from Thomas Andre Riesla. Hello, Mark and Mark. I have some perspectives as a Generation DTS viewer that I hoped you guys could comment on. Just as a bit of context, I'm an electrical engineer that is currently working with defense technology and has a lot of enthusiasm for the technical aspects of the sport. Seeing the innovations and experiments that teams have brought to the tracks over the years is really scratching an itch that I never knew I had. As old school F1 fans are stuck in their ways, my question, why are people opposed to F1 going fully electric? My impression of Formula One is that they should always adopt the newest and best technology available. If fully electric powertrains were faster, lighter, more durable, etc., would you oppose F1 going that route? Any new and better technology that is being skipped just for any other reason than safety feels to me like a mistake. At the end of the day, I'm stuck feeling like people just want ICE, internal combustion engine, for political or nostalgic reason, when we could have stuff like that will be better and more cost effective. So great questions, some great observations. I think that there's a lot to unpack here. And I think that Thomas is touching on a couple of good things, important things that I think he's noticed that some people, I think, are definitely I guess not in favor of dumping the internal combustion engines in whatever form, either be it as a full internal normally aspirated engine or the turbo hybrid or whatever form that internal combustion engine takes for political or nostalgic reasons, as he states. And I think there is a certain segment of fans, but I'm not fully opposed to Formula One going fully electric. My only concern is that when and if they do, that they do it too soon, and that the electric power units that they have available to them do not have the same amount of power output that we currently see with, regardless if it's the turbo hybrid or a turbo engine, whatever, a normally aspirated engine, that there would be a big dip in performance. And that's why I think we're seeing, and I think that's maybe why some people might interpret it as Formula One kicking the can down the road by adopting these, or maybe, I don't want to say adopting just yet, but maybe taking their time in defining what the next generation of Formula One engines are looking like, because I think it's going to be a bridge sort of technology. I think it's going to be a temporary solution that may be in place. I don't think it's going to be for a couple of years. I think that it might be an engine formula that we see for another decade or something like that. I wouldn't be surprised if it is, like a mid to long term commitment. And then at that point, I'm thinking that at some point, the electric engine technology will just sort of catch up, and then it'll just be seamlessly integrated into Formula One, because logically and sensibly it just becomes the way to go. But for the meantime, I think that internal combustion engines in the turbo hybrid format, and these new hybrid and exotic fuels are the way forward, and I think that's where they're going to go.
It's a really great question, and it's timely, one, because we're in the midst of the teams and the sport and the FIA coming to an agreement on what the engine formula is going to look like from either 2025 or 2026 and beyond. And we know there's still going to be an internal combustion engine. Yeah. We know that's going to be complemented by a turbocharger. We know there's going to be some form of hybrid electrification, which is going to be much greater, and Formula One's very excited to tell us all about how they're going to be using much more sustainable e-fuels, which come from all sorts of magical carbon capture devices that we're not actually using today. But I think you and I have kind of hit it on the nail a couple of times, when really what we're going to see in 2025 is F1 kicking the can down the road. I'm now of the mindset that I'm all in on electrification. I just don't think that institutionally F1 is there yet, or they are, but they're not ready to say it yet. And we've heard from Ross Brawn many, many times that, and he's right, that the entire globe isn't going to shift to electrification anytime soon. And there's some types of vehicles that will probably continue to have an internal combustion engine for the rest of our lifetimes, whether that's container trucks or container ships or airplanes. There's always going to be a place for internal combustion engines. And hopefully we find a way to get synthetic fuels or e-fuels into those vehicles to reduce the carbon output. But ultimately, there seems to be an institutional bias or nostalgic value in or placed into the internal combustion engine. My hope is that what we're seeing in 2025 really is a bridge, and that behind closed doors, Liberty and the FIA are talking with the teams and saying, hey, look, we're giving you a 5 or 6 year runway with a engine formula that's relatively similar to what we're doing today. But hey, come 2035, we're going all electric. And maybe they're not ready to announce that publicly, because I think the risk is that, hey, if you announce we are going fully electric, that that opens up a whole bunch of questions that they're not ready to answer yet, which is how are they going to produce 1,000 horsepower? How are they going to produce 1,000 foot-pounds of torque? How heavy are they? What are the battery packs going to look like? Are they safe to drive at 360 kilometers an hour? What if there's a collision? What if the battery ignites? Where are you going to get the batteries from? There's all sorts of questions that they're not ready to answer. So my suspicion is exactly what you said, which is the engine for the formula that we're going to see in 2025 or 2026 is we're kicking the can down the road because we're not ready yet. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the expertise. We don't have the personnel to develop an engine formula that's fully electric for 2025. But we're going to start working on a new formula behind closed doors because he's absolutely right. Come 2035, 2020, or 2040, when every single passenger car and every single dealer lot in North America and Eastern Asia and throughout Western Europe is fully electric, I think it's going to be a tough sell that F1's still running some form of internal combustion engine. So I think it's coming. I don't think there's any opposition behind closed doors. I think it's partly marketing, partly political, partly strategic, but I'm sure they're working on it behind closed doors, and good for them because obviously the internal combustion engine in a passenger car and a sports car is not going to be the future, especially when you consider how many fully electric sports cars are available from dealers today. And there'll be significantly more available in 5 years when F1 will just be debuting its latest iteration of the internal combustion engine.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, I think the one thing that they're getting around is exactly a lot of the technical issues, like you mentioned. I mean, can you imagine that the batteries that they need to power these cars and deliver all these things, like the 1,000 horsepower engine, but the batteries weigh 1,800 pounds or something. It's just like it'll be like driving a dump truck around there because the car would be so. It would be so difficult to handle. So I think they're a long way to being able to replicate the performance and handling in these cars with an electric engine. So it'll come.
And don't forget that it was only a few years ago in Formula E that the drivers had to swap cars halfway through a race because the battery packs weren't strong enough. And that was not producing anywhere near what a Formula One car produces in terms of power.
Yeah. They'll get there eventually, but it might take a little bit longer than we might be expecting. Awesome email. Okay, next one comes from Fu Bear Chu. Hello to both of you. I have two questions about Max Verstappen on his career and recent performance at Sochi. This is a bit of an old email. Apologies for that. But anyways, that was a good one nonetheless. I'm a Max fan, though admittedly, I cannot root for Red Bull. Until Marco retires or Max moves teams, it's tough for me. I have the utmost respect for Max as a driver, and I don't root for anything bad to happen to him. I enjoy watching him race, and he's one of, if not the best on the grid. Lewis fans will probably object to that one, but that's all subjective. So the first question is, how impressive really was Max's performance at Sochi? Was he always has half the grid moving out of his way because the team by team, their fight is not with Red Bull. Overtaking isn't easy, but nobody challenges you either. Is it really amazing that he flew up the grid, especially with screen door Bottas happy to play the midfield game? Second point, has Max's career been a disappointment so far? He's now 7 seasons in and hasn't won a single F1 championship. Wasn't more expected of him by now? Okay, so first question, I don't know if I don't know if I necessarily agree with their fight is not with Red Bull. I think that the fact is Max has one of, if not the best car on the grid, and I think there's very little difference in terms of performance between the Mercedes and the Red Bull. I think that gap is really narrowed over the course of the season. He was just that much better than everybody else. He had the better car and just really carved his way up through the race order. But let's be fair. I mean, he was probably looking at maybe a top 5 finish had we not seen that that downpour, and he just really benefited that he just didn't get caught up in any of the carnage. I think that podium finish, that second place that he had, was it looked awesome on paper. I mean, if you look at that 5-10 years down the road and you never watched that race, and even if you did, I mean, it looks extremely impressive. But I think that if he'd finished, say top 5 and maybe 5th, 6th, I think he would have been extremely happy with that because it would have limited the amount of points he was giving away to Lewis. But the rain really turned everything upside down. I mean, just to ask Lando. And then to the second point, I'll answer both of these and then I'll let you respond, Mark. And the second point is Max's career been a disappointment after 7 seasons. And the fact he hasn't won a championship, I would say no, because we have to remember Max entered the sport very, very young and was promoted, pretty quickly from Toro Rosso to Red Bull at the expense of Danny Kvyat. Promptly wins his first race at Spain in 2016. I mean, that was obviously benefited because of Lewis and Nico Rosberg taking each other out at turn 3 and both ending up in the gravel in that, another one of many infamous comings together that those two had over the years. But I don't think so. I mean, he didn't have a car that was a championship contender until this year. And let's not forget, I mean, he was also learning a lot. I mean, he has obviously a lot of natural talent, but 2 things I think that he had to refine and hone that talent and skill. And then also he needed the car to deliver him a championship. And whether or not he wins one this year, that remains to be seen. But I think that whatever it comes down to, it'll be a very, very small margin to whoever wins this championship. And Max definitely has the car. Would it be a disappointment for him? Sure. But I think that I think he's done as good as he can with what he's had in his career so far.
And I think you've summed it up perfectly. I would never argue or debate that his career has been anything but successful. He came in extremely young. He won his first race with the senior team, Red Bull, in 2016 at Spain. And again, there are some mitigating circumstances that put him in the position to win that race. But that said, under intense pressure from the rest of the field, he hung on at an incredibly young age to win a Grand Prix. I think this is one of those circumstances as well that you're right. He's never had a car as competitive as this one. And I think if he'd had this car with this power unit since 2016 and he'd not won a championship, I think we could probably reflect back and say, yeah, you know what? His team, Red Bull, Christian Horner, they put him in a position to win a championship for 5 or 6 consecutive years and he could never come through. That's a disappointment. Yep. I think we could make the debate that, hey, was Sebastian Vettel a disappointment at Ferrari? I think that's a very real conversation, but maybe one for another day. Yep. But I think the other consideration here too is timing was just bad. And we see this in all of North American major professional sports, right? You look at the fact that Karl Malone and John Stockton never won a title. They probably do, if not for the dominance that was Michael Jordan's Bulls. They potentially could have won 2. And you talk about George Call's 1996 Seattle Supersonics. That team won 60 games in a season, year after year after year. And in any other era, maybe they win multiple championships, but they make the finals once and they lose in 6. So sometimes timing's just bad. Mm-hmm. And in Max's case, he entered the sport right at the peak of one of the most dominant runs in the history of the championship, which of course is the 2014 turbo hybrid era Mercedes AMG team. So timing was just bad. And I think 2022 is exciting because it almost completely resets the sport. We know the power units aren't going to change, but they're going to be locked in. And you could make an argument that the Honda power unit and the Mercedes power unit are awfully close in terms of performance at this point. So it's a good time for them to be locked in. But 2022 kind of resets the sport, and it maybe favors Max, maybe it doesn't. But ultimately, his timing was just bad, and it's obviously no fault of his, but it's tough to come into a sport where Lewis Hamilton's at his peak and a team like Mercedes is at its absolute peak as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, when you look at Max now, it really seems like he's been around forever. And I mean, which is crazy to say for a guy that is still so young, but his time will come. I mean, he's obviously a championship caliber driver. He's got the car, whether or not that pays off for him this year. And then next year, all bets are off until we know who's built what and how it matches up against everyone else. Okay. Next email comes from Devin Rance. Got to watch the Schumacher doc today, and I can't praise it enough. As a Gen DTS fan, I compared it to Jordan's Last Dance, which we both watched and we loved. So if you got Netflix, definitely check that one out. And he's back to Devin's email. He says, I am 32 and wasn't old enough to remember Jordan's Bulls or Schumacher's peak. To me, they were both legends. Like Jordan's Wizards years, I can only remember Schumacher's return and only through ESPN. So seeing this one showed me why he was both loved and hated, just like the dance showed with Jordan. As a documentary, it was gold. Great music, interviews, intense emotions, footage. And while I get you weren't happy with the Senna scene, as a person who only knew he passed from an accident, I don't think they overplayed it. They showed the accident and him getting carried away, and it led the view to feel what the drivers felt. He's just hurt going to the hospital, and it wasn't that they knew on the podium where the doc told the audience it was serious. So if you didn't know the story, it was that way on purpose. Anyway, love the show. Keep it up. I think that's an interesting point of view. And, I just, we both obviously were quite, I don't want to say, I don't know exactly how to word this, but we were quite emotionally touched by that, because we saw that happen, and the whole, and lived through that. I mean, this is no boasting that, we've been around Formula One fans forever and anything like that, but I guess you'll experience that documentary, and especially that whole scene with Senna at Imola in 1994, and his death and everything like that, completely different, because you either watched it and kind of like went through the experience, or like Devin, you've come to it later on and watching it. So I guess you're going to react different to, where you come into the story and how it is for you. But, it's interesting to somebody that has obviously, gone through it and watched it and enjoyed it, that felt that, we thought that it wasn't, it was something they didn't need to show, but to somebody that was obviously not as emotionally impacted as both you and I were, felt that they got it just about right, and felt like that they didn't overstep the line that where it was distasteful or disrespectful. So I think that's an interesting perspective from Devin.
This is a great email, so thanks, Devin. And thanks to everybody that reached out via email and Twitter. Whether we agree, whether we disagree, whether we debate, it means a lot when you take the time to send us a note. And I apologize we don't get to all of them. And there was a couple we committed to getting to tonight that we didn't, so don't be disappointed. There's a couple of great questions that we're going to save for next week, including an email from Toby Louisa Ernst about tires that we're going to save for Thursday, and a couple of other great things. But just kind of reflecting back on Devin's comment, he's not the only one that's actually shared this comment with me. And to be totally honest, almost everybody wanted to talk to me about this topic. And overwhelmingly, the sense was that moment had a place because it played into the narrative and the emotional roller coaster that they wanted the viewer to participate in with Schumacher as he was going through those moments in his life. So I thought that was interesting. And perhaps the perspective is different because a lot of the people that were sharing those sentiments weren't watching Formula One then. And again, that's not a flex. That's not a humble brag. It's just a reflection of the fact that you and I are super freaking old, and most of our listeners are half our age. But I think it is interesting that you and I, we reacted differently because we were there in the moment and we remember this. But for a lot of our viewers, this was the first time they were experiencing it, and they valued seeing that moment because it helped them participate in the emotional roller coaster through which Michael Schumacher went and was documented in the program.
It's interesting. I mean, I went and watched the documentary a day or so after it dropped, about a month and a half ago or whenever it was. And, I must have admit that I, like everybody else that's watched it, really enjoyed it. I found it a very emotional, very visceral experience, and I thought it was very, very well done. But now that I've seen and heard a couple of comments, just like Devin's, I really feel like I should go back and watch it again. I'm sure I'd enjoy it just as much. But now, having kind of been on that emotional roller coaster watching it and kind of lived through and just exactly how they told that Schumacher story and all the different threads that they pulled on, it would be interesting to go back and watch it again myself and see what my take is now that, not that I'm numbed to it, but certainly now that it might not be as intense as the first time around, that perhaps it might have a bit of a different take on things. So finally, JJ in Houston. JJ! And the apologies, I think he sent us another one recently that we may not have gotten to. So
we're such negligent hosts.
We're terrible, terrible people. Anyways, JJ's email says, hope you are well. Enjoy the pod as always. question of pure curiosity. Do you know of any big names or celebrities attending COTA? Are there any famous people that you can expect to see at the American Grand Prix or any GP in general? Also, it was great to hear Mark H. open up about anxiety the other day on the pod. We the listeners, are rooting for you through it all and appreciate your honesty so much. Thanks. So cool. That's awesome. Love that. And certainly appreciate you opening up there the other week, Mark. And, this is a good one. I must admit that I'm not very much of a celebrity watcher. So I don't know.
Oh, I am.
You are? Okay. So let me guess, you've been on the line to Perez Hilton or whoever, so somebody tonight that knows a little bit more, or you've at least watched entertainment.
Oh, PerezHilton.com, TheDirty.com, subscribing to the Hey app because I want to watch Real Housewives of Vancouver from 10 years ago for the 17th time. I'm all in. I'm very, very shallow, and I consume a lot of this wasteful, empty calorie celebrity gossip for some reason that even my wife doesn't understand. So I think one thing that you've probably picked up on, and this is for all of our listeners, is that Liberty and Formula One have always done this atrocious job of almost forcefully trotting out a token celebrity at every single event. So we've seen it before. We've seen Justin Bieber trot it out at Monaco, and we've seen poor Serena Williams trot it out in a race awkwardly when Max Verstappen won and nobody kind of understood how to approach the interviews post-race. We've seen Will Smith at some of these races, but I think my sense has always been that, look, they're being paid to be there, or they're going because it's an opportunity to cross-promote a product, a film, something that they've done themselves. I've never loved it. What I want to see is I want to see celebrities there because they're compelled to be there, because they love the sport, they're interested in the sport, and they're curious about the sport. And I'm not saying that Will Smith, Serena, and Justin Bieber weren't. It just seems forced and unnatural. So we've seen celebrities at COTA before. We've seen Matthew McConaughey, although I think he's appeared at a lot of races. We've seen Michael Douglas, although I think he's been at a lot of races. We've seen a lot of other kind of, I would say, B+ grade film stars at these events. What I'm really curious to see at this event is not whether they trot out some 50-year-old white dude that's been in a bunch of thriller movies in the 90s. What I really want to see is how broadly the appeal of Formula One has grown. I want to see if there's young hip hop stars there, or young pop stars, or young musicians, or young movie stars. I want to see if there's older, established, quality A-list actresses there because they want to participate in the sport that they've been watching on Netflix for the last 3 years. I'm very curious to see, and what I want to see is I want to see them discreetly in the stands watching because they want to be there. What I don't want to see is them trotted out in what's a clear marketing blitz. So I'm curious to see. We've seen them before. My sense is that they're always there for promotionary purposes. I just want to see somebody there because they love it. And what I'm curious to see is JJ Watt going to be there? I don't know if the NFL calendar is going to line up, but maybe he's there Saturday for qualifying. I'd love to see some of these folks because what we are seeing are more and more celebrities sharing their passion for Formula One through social media. Given that this is now the first time we've really raced in the US since the pandemic, I'm curious to see how much of that interest translates into celebrities showing up. So yeah, we'll see.
Do we have a confirmation whether or not Will Smith will be there getting jiggy with it this weekend or not?
Oh my God.
I'm sorry. I couldn't believe.
That song's 24 years old, dog.
I know, but it's low-hanging fruit and I had to go there. But also just sort of based on your...
Dude, you had to save that for Miami, not for Austin. Put that back in the bag and bring that out next May.
I'll bring it out next May. So anyways, yeah, oh God.
Because we're going to Miami.
Yeah, I know. Just don't tempt me.
No,
don't tempt me. I get
we're going, like the song, we're going to Miami.
I get it. Just don't take me down that road. Don't take me down that road. It's a bad destination for everyone. But I was also going to say, judge your comments, you'll be extremely disappointed if they wheel out Jean-Claude Van Damme or somebody like that as their celebrity du jour on Sunday.
On that note, my hard drive's full. We need to sign off.
Very good. All right. Well, guys, thank you so much for downloading, listening to the show. Thank you, as always, for all the fantastic emails and all the tweets and everything like that. If you want to get in touch, by all means, do so. Send us a tweet at ScooteryF1Pod at ScooteryF1Pod. If you want to send us an email, this is where I'm going to get it right, at ScooteryF1Pod@gmail.com. And that's it. That's a wrap. We will be back in a couple of days with the preview for the US Grand Prix at the Circuit of Americas in Austin, Texas. And until then, have an awesome week. And on behalf of myself and Mr. Mark Hamilton, we'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.